Hi, this is Melissa Nash with Checkmark Collections. Have you heard about Reg F yet? Well, you're about to. We've put together a series featuring 7 short videos aimed at topics that are most relevant to the creditor, you. We're going to cover items such as call frequency and communication caps, itemization dates, information needed in the validation notice, and so forth. These issues are important to you as the creditor, and they're definitely important to us as the collection agency. If you have any questions after these videos, please feel free to reach out to me or one of your account executives in the office, and we'll be glad to answer any of your questions. At Checkmark Collections, we always put the check back into your business.
Welcome to our session regarding Regulation F and texting and email in consumer debt collection. This has been a hot button topic for years and years and years. The best news is that the Bureau spent a lot of time querying stakeholders on both sides of the aisle, doing its studies into how consumers want to be communicated with, and concluded that they want to be communicated with just by debt collectors, just as they would anybody else. And that's, these days, text messaging and email. Phone calls are somewhat antiquated. And so this is actually a nice step forward from the Bureau, recognizing that there's been technological advancements since the FDCPA was originally passed in 1977. For our creditor audience members, this is a great opportunity as you are combing through these new requirements and the new commentary in the rule to really be intentional about how you, before the debt is sent to collections, how you can obtain consents for communication through these media, and how you can set up your debt collectors for success and getting those right party contacts by making sure they're getting the consents that they need and they're following sort of your expectations, and there's a clear line of communication about how that's being done. This, for my money, is probably the most critical piece of the Regulation F overhaul for creditors.
I would absolutely agree with that. I mean, for years, we have been giving advice to collection agencies about avoid email, avoid text, and the reason is it was the Wild West in litigation about how those were treated. Every court treated it differently. There was no consistency, so there was no clear way to advise clients on how or if they could even use these different methods of communication. I mean, I think it's important to note it was never expressly prohibited. I mean, we could communicate by email or text previously, but it just wasn't, we didn't have a lot of guidance, and so when I'm advising someone, I'd say, you know, sure, you can do it. I really can't give you a lot of advice on how to, but that is why likely the agencies you've been working with were not giving a lot, or not communicating in that way because we just didn't have good information, and we're probably being advised by their outside counsel not to. But this rule that then provides us with a framework to do so, but I agree with you, Patrick, that the big caveat, I suppose, or the tripwire is it requires a lot from the creditor. It requires the creditor to do quite a bit of heavy lifting in getting the consent and getting the information over to the collection agency so that they can communicate with the consumer in their preferred method. And I think that that is one of the themes of Regulation F when it comes to communicating with the consumer. What is the consumer's preferred method of communication? And so in the forefront of the mind of the collection agency and in the mind of the creditor is, how do I best gather and determine what the consumer's preferred method of communication is? It may be by text, it may be by email, it may be by phone, it may be none of those things. And so finding out how the consumer wants to be communicated with, and then tracking that and getting the appropriate consents in place to make sure that you can continue that conversation. So one of the biggest things that, I think for most of the collection agencies that I've been working with is our consumers that we're dealing with want us to communicate them by email. How can we do that it's going to be easier for them. They can do it on their phone. They can, because there's all sorts of problems with leaving messages by telephone, and there are a lot of tripwires associated with contacting the consumer by telephone and on the cell phone under the TCPA. Let's do it by email. They want it. And so now we have some direction on how we can get that consent to communicate by email. And the reason the consent is important is it creates a safe harbor. And so if the creditor or collection agency obtains the proper consent to communicate with the consumer either by text or email, they get a safe harbor from being sued. Essentially, it lowers it doesn't get rid of the risk, but it drastically reduces the risk of a lawsuit because they have complied with the safe harbor requirements, which is what we're going to talk about primarily in this session.
Those are all excellent points, and I agree with it all. Let me give a couple of top-of-mind considerations before we dive into some of the nuances on the safe harbor, but I agree it's a very important part of the regulation. Reg F sets certain levels of the communication caps, the volume, and that relates to phone calls. And so there are actually no caps with regard to how many times a collector can text or email, but there is some commentary that says if you start to consider it together with the number of times, so let's say you exhaust your number of calls within the given period, 7 calls, 7 days, but then you're doing a text blast in the background of that every day, multiple times a day, you start to create a potential harassment claim, and same goes for email. So I think just a general consideration, be careful and encourage your agencies to be careful. Do not misuse this mechanism, this method of communication, because frankly, if the CFPB does a follow-up study in the next couple of years and finds out that this has been abused, this new shiny toy was not used in a good way, we can all look forward to regulations and additional caps, and so frankly, it'll just be ruined for everyone.
Well, one thing I will just note too, that a big motivator for both the creditor and the collection agency for getting the appropriate consent to use email or text is cost. I mean, before, everything was done by letter, and obviously the cost to send a letter keeps going up and up and up, and most people aren't really opening their mail very consistently. At least that's what we hear. So now we have, everybody uses email, everybody uses their cell phones, they carry it with them for text messaging, and that is a virtually, from an ongoing cost standpoint, a virtually free option to be communicating with the consumer. Now, again, not to overemphasize, but I don't know that we can, that requires there to be the appropriate consents in place to make that a really viable option. But I mean, that can drastically reduce the cost of collection.
Absolutely right. Again, yet another reason why this is really the critical piece, particularly for creditors who are engaging third-party collectors. I will also offer this observation. Basically, when the collector reaches out to the consumer, they're not known at that point. This is a new party to the collection process, and the collector and the consumer, when you get down to it, are just mammals, right? And when two mammals who don't know each other encounter one another in the wild, usually one of two things happens. They fight or they run. And you have to overcome that in the collection process as the third-party debt collector. And so when you start adding in a bunch of attempts to obtain consent from the consumer, so you're already the new party. The consumer doesn't know you. Yes, hopefully they recognize the debt in the name of the creditor, but it's this new, potentially scary piece of the equation that didn't exist before. And now all of a sudden, in addition to asking for money and probably verifying information about who they are, what's the last four of your social, and what's your address, and all this stuff, it becomes a scarier and a more maybe dubious kind of proposition for the consumer. And to then tag on to that, can we email you? What's your email? Can we text you? Can we use an auto dialer to call you? Now, these things can be accomplished if done artfully and intentionally by the collector, and many do it. You can obtain it through maybe a website, a payment website, for example, that a collector is using. But my point, this is a really long way of making a very simple point. It is easier and more organic for the creditor to obtain the consents that include a carve-out so that they apply to their third-party vendors, specifically third-party collectors. So really, creditors, if you're not including a TCPA consent, a text and an email consent in your, if it's medical, in your admission and treatment forms, or if it's a contract service, in your contract, you should do that. You're going to make life not only easier and hopefully less litigation laden for your collector, but just more effective. You're going to get better ROI. So that's a high level thought, but I'm putting that on you, our creditor audience, to do.
Well, and we're going to get into this too, but, and also then keeping that information. I mean, I think a lot of times when we get involved, it's way downstream and things have gone wrong in multiple ways usually, but one of the things we ask for when it's a claim related to a communication that they're claiming they didn't want is, was there a consent at the creditor level? And often there was, but it's not, we can't locate it, it wasn't saved, or whatever it is. But also making sure you have a retention policy in place to keep those consents and then have them be transferred to the consumer, or sorry, to the debt collector, so that they can use them if they need to in their defense.
Absolutely, 100%. So let's circle back to your point about the safe harbor. Is yet another really nice effort by the Bureau to create some nice delineated steps you can take as a debt collector to protect yourself from a lawsuit. When it comes to texting and emailing, and there's also some voicemail requirements under separate sections of the rule, the whole risk for the collector is a third-party disclosure. You know, if I owe a debt and Jessica's trying to collect it, she can't call my grandparents and talk about me and my medical debt and trying to figure out, you know, and asking them to pay it and all of that. We all sort of know that. And so the issue you have with a text message is that people change phone numbers. Email addresses sometimes are shared or don't get used or get opened in the presence of others. And so the safe harbor is specifically designed to say, if you have a consent in place under one of three ways, you are insulated from a claim of improper third-party disclosure. Now, you're going to have to prove that up in a lawsuit, but nonetheless, it provides great defense materials and potentially settlement leverage to try to get yourself or your collector out of the case. So how do you get the consent? One way is if the consumer emails the collection agency. Going forward is then presumed, since they took the first shot, that we can now, as a collection agency, email them back using that address. A second way is if in a conversation or using a payment portal or website, for example, the consumer offers and gives an email address to the collector, and the collector lets the consumer know, hey, FYI, any email address you give us, we're going to use that to potentially communicate with you about a debt. If you do that, that's consent as well. The last one, this applies to our audience quite directly, is if the consumer provided an email address, and I think this applies to text too, but I'm going to let Jess kind of dive into that a little bit separately. But for emails, if the consumer gives it to the creditor, and the creditor, in sort of a goodbye letter, lets the consumer know, hey, this thing is going off to collections, here's the email contact we have for you, may be used by a collector to contact you. And there are very specific requirements boxes that need to be checked in the rule and the commentary. I won't go quite into those weeds. But the point is, there is a way for you, the creditor, to set your collection agency up to have that consent to email the consumer from the get-go, if done correctly. And so we encourage you to study that and build that into your third-party collection process.
Yeah, and the big, I think, hiccups with this is to the extent you don't have a robust policy or procedure in place to communicate with consumers or with your client, the consumer client, via email. Because one of the things you have to do is then track that information, and you have to provide a method and an option to opt out. And so if you send out, when you send out this goodbye letter, or even prior to that, if you've somehow gotten consent to email the consumer, there needs to be this, in order for the safe harbor to apply downstream, there needs to be the disclosure that Patrick was talking about, but then also there needs to be an opportunity and method to opt out of that kind of communication. So you can't just say, hey, we have your email, we're sending them this up to the debt collector, they're going to communicate with you via email. It has to be, and if you don't want that to happen, here's how you opt out, and there's a certain period of time that you need to give the consumer to opt out of that kind of communication going forward. And so that requires that you be able to basically track that and document it, and then give that information over to the collection agency. So one thing I have cautioned with this is, don't do a knee-jerk, I want to start doing email communications until you have an infrastructure in place to track it accurately, because if you don't, then you're just really setting up yourself and the collection agency for a future lawsuit. So this does require some infrastructure to track those opt-outs and then transfer that information over to the collection agency. There is the ability also to do text messaging through the FDCPA regulation. F has given us some guidance there. It does not actually apply as well to our creditors because I mean, based on the comments from Regulation F and just the landscape of litigation, the TCPA, the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, and the sort of disdain for auto dialers and robocalls, this has been further restricted in this way. Although I will say we didn't have really any way to do it before as a collection agency. Now there is a way to do it, but it is more limiting than the email, I think, because of just how much it is disliked.
Mm-hmm.
But basically it requires the collection agency to either get direct consent from the consumer through a web portal, through verbal communication, something to that effect where they have communicated with the consumer and said, look, I'm going to get this, I want to communicate with you via text messaging, et cetera. Can I get your consent to do that? There's disclosures that need to be made. And if they get that, they can do it. So that's that direct consent. They also can respond by text if the consumer has reached out and communicated with them by text messaging. I mean, the advice I've given is what a great opportunity to then get consent to do it. I mean, you technically have it, but if they're reaching out, I always like to have the belt and suspenders so that if they're voluntarily reaching out via text, then to get that consent to have both. So that really does rely on the collection agency to get the consent for text messaging. But I will say, from the creditor standpoint, still really important to get that in the text or cell phone sort of disclosures and consent at the creditor level, because there are avenues that you can include in that consent to use an auto dialer down the road that will apply. So there's two different regulations we're working here with. One is the FDCPA that we're talking about, but the TCPA is in the background, and so it's helpful from that standpoint as well. So, and obviously, if the creditor is using an auto dialer, they have to be doing it anyway,
Right.
But you may as well include language in there about your collection agency because many debts end up there, and so why not have yourself sort of another layer of potential safety from a lawsuit down the road. So that is, the text messaging really impacts the collection agency more as far as getting the consent. But I do think that that's a conversation because you, as the creditor, have the good information, have the up-to-date cell phone information, have the information necessary to start that process for the collection agency. And so making sure you have an infrastructure in place and a dialogue with the consumer that you can be gathering that information to then provide to your collection agency and let them, through the discussion, decide how the best and most cost-effective way to collect on the debt is going to be.
Agreed. So I was a philosophy major in college, so I'm going to try to do the take-home message in the form of a syllogism. You ready?
I have no choice.
Okay. Right party contacts means more money. That's how we make collections work. Consumers demonstrably prefer to be contacted by email and by text. You get more right party contacts by email and text by obtaining consent. It's easier and more organic for the creditor to get consent. Therefore, if creditor obtains consent, they get more money through the collection process.
I think that's actually absolutely true. And I think that is a sage advice from our philosopher, Patrick Newman.
Thank you.